Right, good afternoon, everybody. A very warm welcome to the ODI today. Really amazed and surprised at the turnout given the tube strike. Didn't know we were so popular. Well done for coming today. I think you deserve a round of applause for facing that tube strike. Well done, everyone. Good. Okay, so we're here today to launch a new report, Humanitarian Assistance from Non-State Donors, What's It Worth? You should have a copy on your chair. I'm glad to see that many of you are already flicking through it. Just some house rules. Please make sure you have your phone switched off or on silent. If you plan to tweet, please do so. It's hashtag private aid. In a moment, I'll introduce the panelists. My name is Saleh Saeed. I'm the Chief Executive of the Disasters Emergency Committee. But first, let me just go through about why we're here today. Private giving from individuals, foundations and corporations is an increasingly important source of funding for humanitarian assistance. As humanitarian needs grow and the budgets of many traditional donor governments shrink, many agencies are now, of course, looking to diversify those funding sources, both in established markets and in emerging markets. The response to both the Syria crisis and the Philippines crisis is a good example of this rich diversity and this rich mix of funding. Over a quarter of all international humanitarian assistance came from these non-state sources between 2008 and 2012. In total, financial contributions from private sources amounted to an estimated US dollars 4.1 billion in 2012 alone. That's representing around 24% of the total international humanitarian response. That's also without factoring in the huge amount of non-financial contributions and in-kind support, such as services, expertise and the like, which will obviously make the figure much more higher. So what is the real value of private giving, and what are the benefits in comparison to other sources of funding? Who are the key current and new actors, and do they hold the answers to the future of humanitarian financing? What role can and are emerging economies playing? And how can accountability, coordination and effectiveness of all these diverse resources be improved? Hopefully we'll try to respond to some of those from the panel and take questions from the audience both online and from the floor. So you'll have an opportunity to ask some questions once we've heard the presentation. So let me introduce to you the panel. On my extreme left is Sophia Swithern, Program Leader from the Global Humanitarian Assistance. Sophia leads the Development Initiatives team working on issues related to humanitarian assistance and funding in crisis contexts, having worked on humanitarian issues for over 14 years. Before joining DI, she worked for Oxfam for 10 years, including as Humanitarian Protection Advisor in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Conflict Transformation and Protection Manager in Liberia, and Refugee Policy Advisor working on international and European policy. Please welcome Sophia. On my extreme right, we have Steve Zyck, Research Fellow at the Humanitarian Policy Group, where he oversees the group's research on the role of businesses and the private sector within emergency response and preparedness. He was formerly a research fellow with the University of York's post-war reconstruction and development and has held several other key research roles with major international organizations. Please welcome Steve to the panel. Also on my right, we have Jane Smallman, International Program Manager for Disaster Relief Business in the Community. Jane joined Business in the Community, BITC, in November 2013 and is the lead for the new International Disaster Relief Programme. She has 20 years corporate experience in project and relationship management, marketing, communications and business development. She's an expert in international corporate social responsibility, focusing on the creation and management of partnerships between large corporates and NGOs and UN agencies. Please do welcome Jane. And finally, but not least, all the way from Geneva today, so very brave to come given the tube strike, we have Jordi Passola, Fundraising Coordinator for MSF. Jordi joined MSF in 1996 and worked with the organisation for 5 years in the field. with different positions ranging from financial controller to head of mission in Tanzania, Somalia, Guatemala, and in Spain for the local MSF domestic programs. He later became the Director of Communications and Fundraising for MSF Spain. In 2007, Jordi joined the Geneva MSF International Office as the International Fundraising Coordinator. Please welcome Jordi. So, as I mentioned earlier, we'll soon hear the presentation from Sophia, and then we'll ask some questions to the panel. If I can ask you to hold your questions while the presentation is being done, and then I'll invite questions from the floor and online. Please remember to have your phones on silent while we start the presentation. Thank you. Sophia,
Great.
Over to you.
Thank you very much. So here's our report. So you have it on your seats. And it's been authored by my esteemed colleague over there, Chloe Sturck, who's done the data and the analysis behind it. And if the questions get very difficult, I might bat them over her way. I think I've been told to sit still for my presentation, but I might leap up now and again and point at interesting things on the slide. I'm just going to walk you through some of the key facts and figures coming out of this report. So, as you can see, it's called Humanitarian Assistance from Non-State Donors, What's It Worth? And this question, for us, dealing as we do in data transparency for humanitarian assistance, felt like a pretty important question to ask. And in fact, it's kind of two questions. One is, what is it worth in purely financial terms? And the second question is there something about it, something about this non-state assistance that's worth more than its financial value? Is it worth more than its weight in gold? The rationale behind writing this report was really based on the understanding that in this era where the humanitarian landscape is changing fast and there's this gap growing between the needs and the funding from traditional sources, there's a lot of hopes and expectations and energy being heaped upon alternative non-state sources of funding. But we fear that those hopes, expectations and energy are not underpinned by a corresponding level of data-led evidence. We just don't know how much there is out there and where it's going. So in our report, and what we're seeking to do with that is to begin to rectify that, because we believe if we're truly to harness the humanitarian potential of these non-state sources of funding, and in an ideal world maybe even held strive for some complementarity, interoperability, if we could go that far, then we need to know.
Would you mind moving closer to the mic?
Sorry.
Thank you.
We need to know, for starters, what numbers we're dealing with. Is that better? Can everybody hear me now? Good.
It's for the audience online.
Great. So, method. Shall I
Can you hear
come a
everyone?
little closer even? How about that? How's that sounding? Better? So methodologically, it's not been an easy job. We know that there is decent publicly available data on what DAC donors give, so the traditional DAC donors give for humanitarian funding. There's deeply variable data out there on what the non-DAC donors give, and quite frankly, there's a cloud of mystery around what these non-state funders give. So I won't go into the methodology, it's in the back of the report. But in essence, we directly go to 75 of the big NGOs. Maybe I'll hold this microphone, it's going to be easier. So we go to some of the biggest NGOs, we directly request their data. We go to 6 of the UN agencies with a humanitarian focus, and we go to the ICRC and the IFRC, and then we do a very clever calculation, which Chloe has had to explain to me many times, to help us scale up the figure from that 75 to be globally representative, and we use the OCHA financial tracking service to help us do that scale up calculation. It's an estimate, it's pretty painstaking. But in the absence of decent reporting, it's the best we believe that there is out there. Now, I should say up front that it says humanitarian assistance from non-state donors. It's not the full story. It is a traditional humanitarian actor-centric picture. It focuses on UN agencies and NGOs and the purely financial flows through them, and we're aware that this is just part of the picture. And it's just part of the jigsaw of humanitarian, non-state humanitarian assistance. We know there's a huge amount, and this is probably something will come out in the panel discussion, a huge amount of non-financial support, so goods in kind, partnerships, co-creation. And there's also a huge amount of cash that just bypasses the official humanitarian system altogether, remittances, families hosting refugees. We know that all that is out there and isn't captured in this report, but what we're beginning here, it seemed like, for us, the most feasible, capturable place to start. So, all that to lead you into the facts and figures, and to see what this data actually tells us. So, Saleh just answered some of the key questions, how much there is out there. So in 2012, you see that figure on the end, that far column, there was $4.1 billion US of non-state, and sometimes I'll call it private interchangeably, but of non-state funding channeled through those humanitarian agencies, or channeled through humanitarian agencies. And that's a combination of funds from three main sources. So from individuals, from trust and foundations, and from private corporations. And as Saleh said, in relation to the institutional funding, that's funding from governments, it's not an insignificant amount. It's about 25% of the total of the 17.1 billion total from 2012. And you can also see here, this is where I'm going to leap up a little bit, if you can still get me on camera there. You can see what it does over time. So this peak here is the year where, as you know, there was the Haiti and Pakistan emergencies, and we see in both state and non-state actors a considerable drop. But you can also see there that the percentage drop from non-state actors was actually more than for state actors. So there was non-state actors dropped by about 27%, but state actors dropped by about 1.5%. And we can probably, if we were to extend this, and we're doing the data on a lot of this at the moment, we were to extend for 2013, we'd see probably a significant rise for both, reflecting the crisis in Syria. So let's move on and see where all of this 4.1 billion comes from. For all those private sector enthusiasts in the audience and on the panel, it's fairly sobering graph. So if we look at all of this yellow, the Pac-Man as I like to call it, this was all from individuals. And what we have, so that's the general public giving donations. We have this white piece comes from trusts and foundations, private companies and corporations, and this grey chunk there, which is the other, and that other is stuff that didn't fit into neat categories, and is also other income generating streams from NGOs, like the Oxfam shops or the Kenyan Red Cross hostels, those kind of things. So moving on, we can see where this was raised by. And it's probably no surprise because of the preponderance from individuals. Let me just put that back there a moment. That the majority is actually raised by NGOs. So 93. Difficulty going into the microphone and looking at the slide at the same time so you can hear and see me. So 93% of it was raised by NGOs. That's 3.8 billion in 2012 and 20.9 billion over 4 years. And as congratulations to Jordi and his colleagues of these NGOs, you can see that MSF was by far and away the biggest, and it raised more than the other agencies in our study set put together, and 25% of the estimated global funding, of global private funding total. And what's interesting is if you put those, the top three NGOs in the list together and combine the private humanitarian assistance flowing through them in 2012, it would have made them the 11th biggest DAC donor equivalent of. But the other thing that's quite surprising is the number 2 in the list, which is UNHCR, which is getting an increasing amount of its humanitarian income from private sources. It increased by 9 times since 2006, and in 2012 it overtook UNICEF as the UN's largest fundraiser of private humanitarian assistance. And that's, to me, I saw that and I thought it was a pretty staggering trend, pretty staggering rise that reflects a general trend, and UN agencies are more and more fundraising from private sources. And in particular, the share of private funds from companies going to UN agencies has increased from less than 1% in 2008 to 15% in 2012. So let's break this down a little bit more. You can see from this graph, so the yellow here, we've got it broken down by UN agencies, by Red Cross and NGOs. The yellow is individuals, as you can see. So NGOs, as we explained, the majority comes from individuals. Red Cross, as you would expect, a large proportion. That grey bar is the national societies, the light grey bar, and that actually within itself hides quite a lot of funding from individuals. Calculations we did a little while back suggests that about 40% of funding to national societies comes from individuals. So if we were able to factor that in, you'd see the yellow bar being much larger there. But what was also surprising, again, as we went through this data, was although the UN agencies, as we might expect, are the ones with the largest, or with the largest bit for from corporations, that's the dark grey bar in the middle, and quite a chunk from national societies, they are getting a significant amount from individuals, and they are set to increase that. So we've looked at who gets it, who raises it. I think the big question in everybody's mind is, where does it go? What's it spent on? Whose lives is it saving? And are there, as with state donors, biases, preferences for directing non-state funds to particular crises or types of crisis? This graph was an interesting one for us. What it shows, you can see the grey bars on this side, that's where private funding goes, and on the other side, institutional funding. Be aware that there's different scale on each. And what we did is in this graph, we looked at the top 10 recipient countries of private funding and looked at the institutional funding against that, so where donors choose to put their money. And you can see it conclusions don't leap out from it. There's not an immediate story that comes out from that of either complementarity or overlap, but it is worth noting that only 2 of the crises that are in the top 5 recipients of private funding, so only 2 of the top 5 from private funding were also in the top 5 for donor funding. So the other 3 is a significant difference. So that's Sudan and Somalia that are only in the top 5 for both private and government funding. And there's interesting findings in there for countries such as Haiti and Nigeria, where they feature very heavily for recipients of private funding, but not so heavily for institutional. And as we all know, after the earthquake in Haiti, between 2010 and 2011, there was a pretty significant, pretty staggering drop in donor funding, so government funding for Haiti. There was a drop of 2.6 billion. But if we look in 2012, Haiti was the largest recipient of private funding. But it was only 15th, if we haven't actually got room on this graph, but it's only 15th for government donors. Similar story for Nigeria. At the bottom there, it surprisingly came out as 8th on the private recipients. but it came down way down the list as 52nd for government donors. Conversely, Syria, you don't see mentioned in this graph, partly because this is 2012 funding, but also one might expect that it was there's a large amount of institutional funding that covers it. Another trend that came out of the data for us was this, and that came from DEC data. So from DEC appeals. We looked at DEC appeals going back to 1999, and they suggested that the average, this big difference between the averages spent on natural disasters versus the averages spent on conflicts. So the average amount of funding raised by an appeal related to conflict is 20.8 million. Natural disasters raise on average over 3 times more, and that's 67.2 million. So pretty big difference there. And I'll just flash another slide at you, looking at how that breaks down by in a few different disasters. And you can see on this side closest to me, we've got the natural disasters. Over there we've got internal conflicts. So we've got the Japan tsunami and the Philippines typhoon. Over there we've got Syria and CAR. And you can see the differences in the proportions given between private and institutional there. So we've looked at how much there is, we've looked at where it comes from, who raises it, where it goes. But another question that came up as we were gathering our data from those 75 NGOs and the 6 UN agencies, well, and the Red Cross, is what do humanitarian agencies actually think of it? How do they rate this non-state funding, and why is it important to them? Well, obviously for organisations like MSF and many others, they just simply couldn't, it's invaluable, they couldn't exist without it, and they rely on it to maintain their independence from governments. Agencies also spoke to us about a broad donor promise, and this was World Vision's term, I think, that allows them significant flexibility on the location, on the type of programming and the duration of their spend, so they can use it to fill gaps, like as we saw in Nigeria. They also talked to us about predictability and durability. So despite the volatility in global totals year on year, when private givers give, they do tend to give for a longer period than the normal funding cycles from donor governments. So often they'll give for a 3 to 5 year period rather than, say, a 1 year funding cycle. And also when a DEC appeal or something similar is launched, agencies might not know how much they're going to get, but they know they'll get something in a way that they might not know when they submit their funding proposal to ECHO, whether they're going to be successful or not. And then there's also something that was termed the crowding in effect, which is a new term for me, and I'm using as much as possible because I like it now, that shows the phenomenon where displays of public giving can kickstart funding from donor governments. We saw that explicitly with DFID when they agreed to match the first 5 million from the DEC appeal, so that's an explicit example, but it happens sort of it happens in an unannounced way, and I haven't actually seen any research that tracks that phenomenon, but I think we're all pretty certain that it is there. So that's the roundup of the data. I'm sure we'll have a chance to look into it a little more. Just one final point before I finish, which is please trust our data. There's a huge amount of work that has gone into it. It's rigorous, but don't be seduced by the pretty graphs. It's all very nicely designed and the graphs look lovely, but it's slightly more methodical than this. But the fact is that it's only part of the picture, and we know that, and that's due to the fact that publicly available data is pitiful. Now we know that the heroic team at the OCHA Financial Tracking Service do their best with what is available, but the reporting of private funding to them is pretty minimal. there have been improvements. The amount that's been reported to them over the last year or so has doubled, but it's still in 2013 there was still only about 260 million reported to them of private funding, which is a drop in that 4.1 billion ocean. Whatever else we manage to gather is dependent on public accounts from and annual reports from agencies. So whatever they choose to make publicly available. And even where it is well reported, there's obviously the annual time lag, which we all know is pretty unacceptable or not good enough to inform emergency responses. There's obviously a clear accountability, effectiveness and efficiency case for more clear, accessible information that's made available in a timely manner, comparable across the board. And that's why we work quite closely with the IATI, the International Aid Transparency Initiative, and the Financial Tracking Service to try and make that standard, the International Aid Transparency Initiative standard, work better for humanitarian actors. And we do all this because we really strongly feel that non-state funding needs to be better documented, and it's simply far too important not to know what's out there.
Thank you, Sophia. Thank you very much. Let me actually ask just a follow-up question. You mentioned there the stats between giving for conflict and giving for natural disasters. Perhaps you can elaborate there if there's any particular trends around that, and also if state actors actually drop their funding when they know there's going to be a huge public appeal, if you like. And maybe Jordi and Jane, you might be able to contribute to that once Sophia's answered.
So the trend that we found on the difference between natural disasters and conflicts was from the DEC appeal. So this represents how the public respond, and I think there is a very clear trend there that the public do dig deeper when on a natural disaster, on a rapid onset crisis rather than a conflict. But this looked also at where the funding gets spent and showed a difference proportionally. So I think that the biggest trend there is where you look at the giving directly from public. And your second question
is that did the figures show there's actually any decreased funding from state and institutions when they realise there may be lots of money coming in from the public or private sector?
Wouldn't that be interesting? How on earth would you?
No.
Yeah, it would be
maybe one for
great
next
to
time.
ask that. If there are any donors listening online, I guess what we did have a little look to try and see the crowding in effect work the other way. So to see the timings of when, say, DEC appeals or public appeals were launched, and whether there was a correlating kick-in from governments. I don't know how we'd look at that the other way. We'd have to know what they were going to do and then didn't do, whether there was a drop-off, because I wonder if anybody else has experienced that from the funding end, whether...
No, I think, definitely the case of MSF is not an exception in terms of this trend where we see that public responds very generously to natural disasters, and while the more the conflict-related crises are more depending on institutional funds. We clearly, I think that we've seen it in MSF. I think it applies to the whole sector. We all struggle to raise funds for Syria, and we're struggling to raise funds for Central African Republic and for South Sudan today. And at the same time, we are almost overwhelmed by the response of the public, the generosity when we have an earthquake in Haiti, or a typhoon in the Philippines. That's clearly the case for us. When it comes to the natural disasters, for us, to understand the evolution of private income in MSF, emergencies have been a key driver of that growth, definitely. If we think about the tsunami in 2004, Haiti in 2010, emergencies, they basically take us to the next level. Because and they are a great opportunity in terms of income, in terms of raising funds in the short term, but also, in terms of visibility, in terms of positioning the organization, and even more importantly, I would say, and I think we're seeing this more and more, in terms of potential, new regular donors for the organization. I mean, that's really, I think, the real value of an emergency in terms of private funding. In the case of Haiti, for instance, in MSF we raised 100 million euros because at some point we kind of put a hold on it. We were raising more than we were going to spend. But for me, the key thing is that there were 1 million people that gave money to MSF for the first time. So 1 million new donors that you can, try to cultivate and convert into regular donors if you manage to build the trust that it takes to follow that road. So in that sense, I mean, clearly those that we so-called CNN emergencies are a great opportunity for different reasons. But on the other side, I do think that they are also a risk. I mean, and that we have to be very careful in those moments when we raise money on the emotion of an emergency. We have to be very careful on how we raise the money, and then on how we spend it, and then how we provide accountability to that. And we see that again from both perspectives: the perspective of an opportunity and the perspective of a risk. And we specifically in MSF, we have an approach, what we call the needs-driven approach to raising funding emergencies, which basically means that we raise as much as we need based on the needs identified and basically the operational response that we're planning to do. And I think probably we're kind of very radical on that kind of approach. But on the other extreme, sometimes we are a bit worried when we see organizations taking a fundraising, driven approach, and how far you can take that approach. And sometimes, basically, from my personal experience, I mean, organizations raising funds in the emotion of emergency without the intention or the capacity to be responding to those emergencies, and then calling MSF to see if you want the money that we have raised, or even raising emergency funds to be spent in long-term projects. I mean, where I think there is a tension and a balance to be found there. Or even more recently, we see kind of an explosion of the use of disclaimers that not necessarily very big, but at the end, if you read, it basically says we will spend the money, however we think it's best, not necessarily on the occasion that it has been raised for. So these issues, also the issue of accountability, and we'll probably talk about that. I think, again, both sides of the coin, the opportunity, but also the risk. And I think there's some limits to this emergency fundraising that we need to be aware of if we want to build that trust of our donors that allows us to really take them just from, punctual donors for an emergency to regular donors who one day, they will also be contributing to respond the needs in Central African Republic, in Syria, or in South Sudan.
Okay, thank you. Just on the issue about, I think you touched, Sophia, about the donor promise, I think it was World Vision, but isn't there a responsibility on organisations, NGOs in particular, to maximise the funds raised during that particular sort of sweet spot, if you like, when there's an emergency? Take your point about what you said in terms of that some organisations may raise and not have difficulty in spending it, but isn't there also a responsibility to maximise the funds?
I think there is a responsibility to maximize the funds based on basically what your response will be to the emergency. I think there is what happens in this situation. There is a tension between operations and fundraising, and as I said, we take a very operational, needs-driven approach because basically our organization, the managers are basically doctors who are basically worried about the operations and are the operations who are driving the fundraising. And I think while taking, there's a responsibility on basically that opportunity, there's also a risk on taking it too far. And if you have fundraising driving the operations and driving the communications, I think you may end up basically raising amounts of funds that you don't necessarily have the capacity, or in programs that are necessarily relevant to respond to the needs. So I think there is a tension there, and there is a balance to be found. And again, if you take that a bit too far, there is a risk of kind of backfiring the fact that it is an opportunity, and I think there is a responsibility there to avoid that as well.
Okay, thank you. Steve, yeah.
Just comment on that. I think also the risk not only applies to the general public, but also to a lot of the business and corporate contributors that we're talking about in there, that the GHA study is looking at, because I think we're in the same risk of making a contribution to a humanitarian cause look like a one-off, do this now, this urgent crisis, this emotive appeal. But what a lot of aid agencies are increasingly seeking is a much deeper form of long-term partnership. So we end up changing the discussion away from innovation, away from long-term partnerships, away from mutual learning and experience sharing, and we orient it around this 2-week period in the aftermath of a crisis. And then oftentimes, have the best of intentions to follow that up with the kind of longer-term partnership arrangements, but that might not actually happen. And instead of actually building that relationship, you do sometimes give the impression that that is this one-off, what can you give us sort of relationship, rather than a two-way dialogue.
Thank you. Jane, perhaps, you support and work within the corporate sector side of funding, if you like. Is there any trends or sort of preferences from the corporate sector in terms of what kind of funds they give, whether it be for natural disasters or conflict, or would they prefer based on established relationships they have at the moment?
I think the trend for the public sector has definitely been led by natural disasters as opposed to the slow onset or conflict. And I think in terms of overstating the obvious, it's because they're less complex. Getting involved in something that is led by your employees' hearts in terms of seeing the least vulnerable communities affected by something that wasn't prepared for necessarily, does lead them to get involved and publicly support the natural disasters. I think they tend to stay away from disasters that have the government instability or rival fractions or have political forces significantly involved, because that's just not commercially viable for businesses to get involved in that area. They'd rather focus their efforts, because let's face it, there are enough disasters to go around, on the less complicated natural disasters. But I think when we're talking about the private sector, we really need to understand what the influences are that will affect their decisions as well. If you say look at media coverage, if you take 2010 where you had the Haiti and the Pakistan floods, you see that there was a significant support from both the private sector and individual giving to the Haiti, especially from the UK, but from the US there wasn't so much giving to the Pakistan floods. Also, I think you have to take into consideration the politics around this in terms of how different communities will give to different countries depending on what the political stance is between those countries. Also, I think we need to take into the fact of the area of giving fatigue. Businesses can't budget, especially in this financial climate, to give to multiple disasters that arise through the year. We can't decide or predict how those disasters are going to affect businesses, employees, clients, and the markets they're working in, and therefore that needs to be taken into consideration. I think also the other element, which I alluded to earlier, is you've got to take into consideration the public perception around corruption and political terrorist influences, which I think had a distinction between what happened with Haiti donations and what also happened with the Pakistan floods.
Thank you. Sophia, I noticed there was an interesting section about zakat and the role of zakat in private giving, and particularly with emerging markets in the Middle East and North Africa and beyond. Could you tell us a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, sure. So zakat is an area that everybody's getting terribly excited about at the moment. And UNHCR have recently put out a zakat for Syria appeal, and they're not the only ones who are looking into zakat as an important form of humanitarian funding. Now, in the data that we presented, it's likely that a fair amount of zakat was captured because we include data from Islamic Relief, so it's likely that some of that is included in there. But there's a huge amount. The monetary value of zakat is potentially massive. We tried to get a figure on it, and somebody gave us the very accurate range of somewhere between 200 billion and 1 trillion. But all that's to say is there is a lot, and even if you go for the smaller end of that enormous scale, the 200 billion, that's still more than 10 times more than total humanitarian assistance in a year. So it would be wonderful if we were able to track that. And obviously that's, together with other factors, is what's behind a lot of agencies looking to emerging markets. So it's partly the zakat potential, but also obviously emerging economies and the potential that they pose both from their private sector and from individual giving. So we're seeing a number of initiatives from different agencies looking to different emerging markets. Jordi, I'm sure you'll be able to talk about MSF and South Korea and South America. World Vision, in 2000, they're increasingly getting a huge amount of their funding from Asia. So back in 2002, World Vision's Asian offices contributed about 10% of their global income. In 2012, that had risen to 25%. And that's not factoring in, obviously, the Philippines disaster in last year. So that would probably, factoring that in, would be increasing as well. And then, of course, there's the national societies of the International Red Cross and the Federation that based in a number of emerging economies and have that interesting double role where they're both fundraisers and they're first responders.
Okay, thank you. Steve, did you want to come in on this point as well?
Sure, I think that...
I think if you leave it on the... because it's causing some feedback. So if you
okay,
leave it on
fair enough. I always wanted to be a musician of some sort, so I like to hold it. But no, I think one of the interesting things that came out of the study that we did on the role of the private sector in emergency response and preparedness, and especially the case studies in both Jordan and Indonesia, is really just looking at the role that zakat is playing in driving individual humanitarian contributions, and also in kind of charting the way that the private sector contributes to humanitarian action in these regions. Not to question the $201 million figure for corporate contributions, but I think we should also keep in mind that not only the non-financial side, but that this idea that a business gives money to humanitarian causes is a relatively Western concept. And one of the things that we saw in a lot of these countries was the business doesn't give the money to the aid agency. It's the individual who does it. It's the business owner, it's the people who are affiliated with the business who actually do the giving instead of the business. So a lot of what might look like individual private giving is actually beneath the surface coming from prominent business people and coming from the coffers of businesses. So I think there is a lot of overlap there. But I think it also, the question of zakat highlights another challenge that, at least in certain parts of the world, that they do face, and I guess this applies to individuals as well as to businesses, is zakat tends to be concentrated, 80-90% of it around certain times of year where people are providing zakat or paying zakat. And at those times, organizations are flush with assistance, buying animals, feeding tens of thousands of people. But how do we get that to be more of a sustained force in humanitarian action? How do we get it to last throughout the year? And how do we get the zakat contributions away from this consumption model and towards more of a lasting force in humanitarian action over the course of the year, and not just about feeding people in the short term.
Thank you, Steve. Jordi, can I come to you about on the added value of non-state funding in comparison to obviously state funding?
Yeah, absolutely. Just let me just say to complement that. I mean, because I think that reflects, in a way, an issue and a problem in the sector that we also have in MSF, which is an issue of geographical diversification or lack of geographical diversification. I mean, if you did this analysis from a geographical perspective, in the case of MSF, we would see that 80% of the income comes basically from markets in Europe and North America, from the traditional and increasingly saturated markets. And I think the picture, with some exceptions, would not be very different from the sector. So there's an issue here in terms of basically increasing income from the emerging markets, from Asia, Latin America, and I think definitely this is a trend that in different shapes and forms and through different channels, but we will clearly see an increase of effort and an increase of investment in Asia, in Latin America, in the Middle East, and probably in the coming years also in Africa. I mean, I think we're all asking ourselves that questions, and all fundraising strategies are questioning the issue of the need of geographical diversification, and that's just one more example. So basic, sorry, about the added value. No, clearly, I mean, for me, and you've mentioned, I mean, some of the advantages of private funding and some of the the added values that it brings. For me, basically, I would summarize it in three things. I think private funds allows you to be reactive. It allows you to be independent, and it allows you to be need-driven. I mean, for me, these are the three added values, as opposed to institutional funding, where basically there's less reactivity, less flexibility, where basically the needs are not necessarily the only driver. There are also basically political agendas and other drivers behind that funding. So it allows you to be more reactive, it allows you to be more independent, and it allows you to react basically based on the needs. And I think that the message that comes out from the report, and I think it comes out very clearly, is that this increase basically on private funding from not only NGOs but also across the UN agencies, across the Red Cross. I think it's very good news. I mean, in the sense that it will allow more actors to be driven basically by this. I mean, let's say in MSF we consider and we believe and we are critical with the aid system of today, precisely because of the lack of reactivity and because of the lack of independence. I mean, if we go back to South Sudan today or Central African Republic, there is an issue of the aid system and the capacity to react to the needs in an efficient way. Yeah? And we think that part of the reason or part of the problem is because there is kind of a logic where you have the UN agencies very much dependent on institutional funding, and at the same time you have many NGOs very much dependent on the UN funding, but also on the logistics of the UN and on the kind of the coordination mechanism. And that kind of logic, it becomes a bit of a trap that means at the end that the aid system is not as efficient as it could be or as it should be. So in that sense, the fact that there is an increase on private funding at in NGOs, but also at the UN, the ICRC, who are also really pushing for it, I think it's very good news, because it will bring more reactivity, it will bring more independent choices, and it will bring more capacity to really respond on the basis of needs. And I think that's basically at the end. If we go back, if we go back to the synthesis of humanitarian action, that is what it is about. It's about people helping other people only on the basis of need and independently from any kind of political or other agenda. So I think that will basically allow humanitarian action to go back to the origins and to be really effectively response to the needs in the big conflict settings of today.
Thank you. Jane, perhaps you can just come in at this point about whether you find in your role that corporates are actually maybe stepping away from giving sort of free money, as it were, in terms of complete independence of how it's spent, and actually putting down a lot of conditions where it's starting to look as if though it was institutional funding. Do you find that more often now?
I think there may be a creep towards that. But I think that's coming with a greater understanding of the role of business in society and what they can give, and also how they will be seen in terms of the accountability of what they give. I think the rapid globalization of recent decades has shown businesses that they are integrated in society and in communities far away from the HQ that might be based in New York or London. And this realization is, I think, moving them away from the philanthropic check writing to getting more involved, whether that's financially or non-financially, but definitely towards more collaborative partnerships between business and the humanitarian community. And I think there's several reasons behind that. One of them you could suggest is the financial crisis has made them look at their budgets a little bit more closely in terms of what they're actually giving and the value of that giving, but also the realization that of the value of their products and their services and their expertise could be to the humanitarian community in increasing the efficiency and the effectiveness of those collaborative partnerships, in bringing in expertise from those on the ground to those that may be providing innovation around new technology. And I think that realization is definitely shifting them to a more collaborative and informed relationship with the humanitarian community.
Okay, thank you. Steve, I'm going to ask you the final question, and then I'm going to open up to questions from the floor online. What can we do to make reporting on humanitarian assistance more transparent?
Right. We were discussing this issue, well, first over lunch and then before the event. And this is the slot where we highlight all the problems with the financial tracking service. And I guess we start the discussion about how we can do it better at some point. But jokes aside about the financial tracking service, I suppose that's a joke many people find particularly funny, come to think of it. But I think you're right. At this point, what do we miss? I mean, even looking at the range of forms of funding that we see in GHA's excellent report, we're still missing out on the remittances. We're still missing out on pretty much the full non-financial value of the private sector's contribution. We're missing out on a lot of forms of assistance, things that we can't quantify, things that are below the radar. I mean, a lot of countries giving to a local organization, rather than through a major international NGO or UN agency, isn't recorded, isn't seen. Coming from the U.S., there's also not necessarily the most professional organizations, but a large volume of assistance that goes through small religious organizations that would have no idea what the financial tracking service is, let alone how to interact with it. So just how can we do it better? And I have no idea is the nice answer, but I think that it's something that we need smarter people than some of us to think about, and that we need to figure out how we can actually start to capture and quantify some of these diverse contributions that are coming into different countries. And I think as we do that, one of the most important things will be not to do it ourselves as aid agencies or even as researchers, and really to make sure that we're working much more with the private sector in developing an interactive, accessible portal so that people can easily input data about contributions and access that data to see what's going on in terms of institutional and private contributions. But even beyond that, I think that could involve working with telecommunications companies and mobile network operators and credit card companies and remittance companies and the wide variety of businesses that are involved in getting resources into crisis affected areas.
Thank you. Jordi, you wanted to comment on this?
Yeah. No, I would just say that yes, of course. I mean, through more visibility on the private funding, and we probably need other mechanisms to track those trends and to have that more visibility. But I think also that there is a risk to us. I mean, financial transparency and tracking, it's only one small part of accountability as we see it. And I think there is somehow of a risk of looking at accountability just kind of as a technical financial exercise of tracking, you know, where the money comes from and where the money goes, which is something that has to be done. But at the same time, I think that accountability goes, you know, much beyond. It's about the finance, it's about the money, but it's also about the operations. And at the end, I think, accountability, it's really more of an attitude and a choice that we make that will help and contribute to build that trust of the donors that we were talking about. And I think there's a lot of room for improvement on accountability, starting with MSF, because we tend to, you know, to focus on explaining who we are and what we do and how we spend our money, and this needs to be done. But somehow we are missing, for me, a second kind of level, which is really to explain what are the challenges that we face in doing so, what are the barriers that we have to overcome, what are the difficult choices that we have to make, and what are the, you know, the mistakes and the lessons that we learn. So there's this sort of dimension of accountability that I think needs to complement more the financial kind of and technical element, and I think both are fundamental, and there is a risk on reducing it just to the kind of the financial part of it. So just to and sometimes, and again, and I think in our case, I struggle very much to really try to be more open, more transparent, more accountable on the operational side of things as much as on the financial, because both complement the let's say the accountability and the transparency.
Thank you. Okay, Sophia, you wanted to come in on this?
Come in there with just a couple of final points, not wanting to eat too much into the questions from the floor. I think you're completely right. I think accountability is more than just budget sheets, but it's an important place to start. I think on what you phrased, Steve, as the below the radar stuff, there's inroads that can be made on that, certainly on the remittances side of it. We're fairly reliant at the moment on World Bank data on remittances. Again, decent enough place to start, but we know that doesn't capture all of it. That, for example, that's reliant on government sources. So if you look at the World Bank data, there's nothing out there for Somalia, for example. But I think those fairly quantifiable pieces, we can look to money transfer organisations, other such sources to supplement the quantifiable bit. The in-kind, much harder. And then on the above the radar stuff, so on the stuff that does go through traditional channels and that is quantifiable, there is a lot that can be done to improve. One is to better and more frequent reporting to the FTS, and we do have this vision of IATI Future and International Aid Transparency Initiative Standard Future. It's going to be a while getting there. Where we have a standardised, easy-to-use, humanitarian, fit-for-purpose system that allows people to just publish, organisations just to publish one set of data and use it often. So you're not reporting to 10 different donors and to the FTS, you just put it out there in a detailed form and it serves many functions. Now there's a few things that we can all be doing to get involved in making that standard more fit for humanitarian purpose, but also putting a bit of pressure on donors to at once commit to IATI, but at the same time decrease their reporting requirements for their own purposes, so that it becomes a substitute rather than an additional reporting burden.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to take 3 questions from the floor, and then I'll take 2 questions online. Any questions from the floor?